Oh my god! Yes! Chat, we qualified to grads! We qualified! We qualified, boys! We qualified!
The incredible run of Mongraal and Savage. On December 12th, 2023, both Mongraal and Savage announced that they will be playing together. This was huge. As we all know, Mongraal is considered one of the legends in Fortnite for his insane clutches and mechanics that were ahead of his time in Chapter 1. And I'm sure we all know the Stark season of Mongraal in Chapter 2. This announcement, well, it took everyone by surprise. Before this, Mongraal had played with Savage on stream and people started writing in chat that Savage should duo up with Mongraal for the FNCS. Bearing in mind that at this point, Mongraal had come back from a full 1 year break from competitive, as his last competitive game was on November 17th, 2022. So for this reason, Mongraal was definitely not sharp with his mechanics, and that would show with his gameplay. After the announcement, Mongraal started putting in the hours, streaming up to 12 hours, playing every duo cash cup with Savage so that they can get the synergy up to the mark. Both had their eyes on the FNCS Major 1, which would start on 26th of January of 2024. Things were looking rough for Savage and Mongraal. They had played together for just over a month. Mongraal had come back from a massive competitive break, and the average pro had obviously gotten better, so they needed to play out of their minds for any chance in the FNCS. However, we can't forget how good MrSavage was playing. He had been playing the game consistently from the release, and at this time frame till this current day, he's considered to be in his prime. The only placements they had behind their backs before the FNC had started was a top 28 in session 1 of Duo Cash Cup, and then a top 50 in the same Duo Cash Cup but in session 2, earning them $225. Everything else was less than top 100, which is not considered to be ideal. Once the open qualifier 1 starts, and they start off slow with a top 419, then they ramp it up to a solid top 78, which is really good. At this stage of the FNCS, they have to play 2 qualifiers for 2 weeks, each week 5 sessions, and then they have to take out the average series points, and they need to place in the top 250 at least to move on to the next stage, which they successfully did, even though the next week performance was mediocre compared to their first. They had gotten a top 78 and then they got a top 75. The other rankings were too found, so to average it out, it balanced all together. Even though the second week was pretty horrible, it was pretty shambles, they couldn't even make it to top 100 in any of them. Since Mongraal and Savage were in the top 51 to 250 part of the leaderboard, they were put into lower semi-finals, which would mean that they would need to get to top 50 to move on into the grand finals. And that's just an oversimplified version. I just don't want to sit here and bore you guys with this set out how FNCS is done currently, because in my opinion it's just too complicated for the average person. Or they can get a Vic Roy in the first 3 sessions. Their semi-final performance was spectacular and no one expected this. They started the semi-final with a solid top 86 and then a top 12, which actually moved them to upper semi-finals. However, in there they would get a top 26, which would put them back into lowers, and then they had a disappointing top 41. But on the final day, when they needed to get to top 15 to just qualify into the grands, Mongraal and Savage did the unthinkable.
Guy down left, you've seen him in storm on the left. Grapple up height. Grapple up height. Nice. 1v1.
1v1.
Let's go!
They got themselves a Vic Roy, and the Vic Roy single-handedly qualified them into the grand finals. And I remember seeing over 100k people were watching at that current moment. Combined viewership was insane, and Mongraal and Savage pulled through with a Vic Roy, and I'm sure you remember that. From just getting 1 good placement before FNCS to now qualifying to the grand finals in the hardest region of EU was fantastic, and no one really expected this, even though lots of attention was on them, but no one really expected them to make it this far. Mongraal and Savage landing spot was the Tony Stark mansion, and they were getting contested by another pro team. And usually if a team gets contested in grands, then we assume that they ain't doing well, and let me explain why. You have 12 games in the finals. Let's just split the odds 50-50, meaning 50% of the time Mongraal and Savage win the spawn fight, and 50% of the time the other team wins the spawn fight. Then 6 out of 12 games, Savage will make it out alive. But what's the probability that they actually make it to the end game? And in those 6 games, well, they need to get some serious points. Well, only 3 out of the 6 games they actually might make it to some like end game, if you get what I'm saying. And that is far worse for people that are just not getting contested at all, because they have the whole 12 out of 12 games not dying of spawns, so they can just play the game out through and they have a higher chance at getting more points than them basically. Now that we know that, Savage and Mongraal finals didn't look too good. For the first day of finals, they died on spawn 5 out of 6 times, placing top 39. And on the second day, they placed top 34. Cumulatively, they came top 39 in the finals. By cumulatively, I just mean the average of the 2 days, which is definitely not bad for the circumstances, but they could have done a lot better. Now let's talk about the major 2, which was the next FNCS, and that started very quickly, so they barely had any time to prepare, but instantly you could see the improvement. In the first open qualifiers, they placed top 179 in the very first session, then they placed top 14, which is incredible, then they placed top 77, which is insane as well, and then 68, which just shows consistency. They did really well, a huge improvement to the previous performance in the open qualifiers. 3 out of 4 times hitting top 100 is really consistent. They tune it down a little bit in the major 2, because at this point, since of their dominant performance in the open qualifiers 1, they had already made it into the semis. So at this point, of course, the motivation is going to be low. They could only manage to get themselves a top 65 once. Unfortunately, didn't qualify to the later rounds, but they had made it into semis. So they were in the lower bracket, of course, because they didn't do that well in the opens qualifiers 2. However, when the semi-finals actually came, they had a really disappointing run. They got top 102 in the lower bracket, and then the very next day they got top 86, but due to this lackluster performance in low semis, they were kicked out, and unfortunately they couldn't make it to grands. Now let's talk a bit about this current FNCS that's happening, the major 3. Top 39 in the first FNCS was good, but nowhere near the placement you need to make it to land, and that's what Savage wants to do with Mongraal. That's the main and the end objective. They need to make it to top 15 in grands to make it to lands. With that in mind, and since top 15 is both EU and NA, go to LAN. In theory, it is easier to make it to top 15 on NA due to less overall people playing. So Mongraal and Savage moved to NA just before the FNCS. They had enough time to play some duo cash cups, and unfortunately their performance in duo cash cup wasn't too good. They were sometimes not even making it to the round 2 of duo cash cups, and people were starting to speculate that they ain't going to do well in the FNCS, and the FNCS was going to start on the June the 14th. They got to top 71, which put them through the opens into the semis, but since they got into the 51 to 250 bracket, they had to start their semi journey in the lower bracket. Their perfect match history, first 3 games were all wins, and a second and third in semi-final lower bracket, which was really good. They came second. First was Acorn and Cold, and that was just because they were after how insane they are at the video game. They were just rushing everyone. However, Mongraal and Savage held their own. They won their first 3 games, which is really good, and then they came a top 39th, which is okay, and then they came a second and a third place. They ended up second in lower brackets, so that the next day they were promoted to the uppers, and all they needed to do there was to win a game for a straight ticket to grands or stay in uppers, and for that they needed to just be top 25 in the final day so that they can move on. Unfortunately, they couldn't win a game in uppers, but they stayed consistent, and from this point Mongraal and Savage were one of the most consistent teams going. The final day of uppers comes, and Mongraal and Savage got top 10, which is more than enough to go through grands, as they only need to make top 25 to make it. They played exceptional in the first 2 games, and in the last game they trolled as Savage died to fall damage. This had been a dream run for both Mongraal and Savage. They had been doing amazing, and we all want them to see them win grand essentially, or at least make it to lands. It will be so hype. This means a whole lot to Savage, since he is still yet to win a FNCS. And bearing in mind this run in the FNCS on NA, they were getting contested by Def and Edgy at the drop spot 4 out of 5 times, which is absurd. 80% chance of winning. Mongraal's clutched up. Mongraal was doing the most. Mongraal had actually the most damage dealt, which is actually really crazy. And that's it for this video. If you did enjoy, make sure to leave a like and subscribe, and also watch this video on the screen right now if you're interested, and peace out.